the title of this talk is Dakinis and Demonesses, and something like Tales of Female Feminine Awakening or the Sacred Feminine. I mean, there are a lot of people now who kind of see that gender is a problem, that it's that a binary is limiting and what's the word, like out of date, old-fashioned, and that we should just go beyond gender. And I think for some people that's probably a good thing. And for other people who are cisgendered, maybe they identify with whatever gender they're assigned at birth. And I think we have to live and let live. But the reason we talk about the sacred feminine is not because we want women to be women and men to be men, but because people who appear as feminine or identify as women or girls are still oppressed by gender every day in the world. There's 1,000 women murdered every week just for being women by people who claim to love them. There's 55 million girl children waiting to attend school in developing countries. Women are still earning less than men and still doing most of the world's work, not just work in the workplace, but work at home. You know, and though we have in many countries come a very long way, there's still a long way to go. And another reason why I find the sacred feminine something that is so interesting and so pertinent is because for a long time in religion or in spiritual paths, the feminine was denigrated and suppressed and thought to be inferior. And the masculine was emphasized as superior, as logical, as rational, as scientific, as empirical. And the feminine was dark, tumultuous, dangerous, seductive, deceptive, unpredictable, muddle-headed, irrational, and so forth. So I think part of reclaiming the sacred feminine is it's not just for women, it's for men also to reclaim their own emotional life, their own capacity for feeling and sensitivity and love. So it's reviving the balance, or you know, that intuitive wisdom in all of us. And for I mean, you go into a temple in Asia, and mostly you'll see men. You'll see a Buddha statue. You'll see the statues of some famous monks. If you go into a Tibetan monastery, you'll see, you know, like 50 of the lineage gurus on the wall. If you go into a Zen temple, even in the West, you'll just hear this lineage of men in a Zen temple, you know, the lineage of men. And it's like, if you don't question it, if no one questions it, it becomes normal, and you start to kind of hate yourself as a woman. You start to kind of think unconsciously, what's wrong with me? And that's not good. So it's time, you know, there were and always have been enlightened women. There were and always have been Buddhist queer people and non-binary people and trans people as well. They've always been here. It's just who the spotlight was, you know, who's holding the spotlight, who's controlling the historical narrative. And for about 3,000 years, it's been men. But before that, you know, there was the goddess worshipping religion, and in a lot of indigenous societies, women are still, or non-binary people are still priests and lineage holders and healers, you know, in a more informal sense. Whenever a religion becomes taken over by the state, it tends to be the domain of patriarchy, because it's a culture of dominance, you know, so that religion enables and gives justification to the state. But there are so many awakened women practitioners, and it's time that we remembered their stories. And these are disobedient, outspoken, fierce, fiery women who are not prepared to settle for mediocrity. These are the kind of women that are troublesome to the establishment and that defy the establishment's role for women, which is, you know, obedient, submissive, supporter of the state, mother to the children, especially mother to sons, but always in the background and always submissive. And that is why I find Dakinis so fascinating, because Dakinis are fierce, wild, semi-enlightened beings. Some of them are nature spirits, some of them are enlightened beings, and they appear in a myriad of forms, peaceful and wrathful, to awaken others, not through intellectual discourse in comfortable ways, but in shocking, intuitive ways. And they're a messenger of wisdom, you know, with unconventional wisdom. They appear like the moon appears in water in the world, in countless forms, in countless ways, to show others that women, as much as men, can manifest enlightenment that is not I mean, I think even the way, okay, for now, I'll just say I'm speaking as a cisgendered woman, okay? Doesn't mean what I'm saying is absolute. I'm just speaking from my own point of view. But the cisgendered women I know, the way they teach is a little bit different to men. The way they embody the spiritual path, the way they don't talk about emotions as an enemy. They talk about emotions as an ally. They talk about emotions being messenger of something wrong. Something is not completely right, you know? Whereas a lot of the male teachers I've heard in the past have sometimes described emotions as a problem, as a distraction, and you need to kind of get them out of the way and just have peace. Whereas the women I know talk about embodiment. They talk about their bodies, they talk about their families, they talk about a relationship with community, they talk about practical action. And I'm not saying, you know, men don't, but I just notice men tend to emphasize, some men tend to emphasize peace and wisdom, whereas women come from a more embodied place. So I feel like, and I also think that's why it's so valuable to have a diversity of teachers, like mothers and older people and younger people and queer people and non-binary people. That's why we need diversity, because that garners a richness of the different kinds of awakening that are possible. So there are 5 Buddha families of Dakinis. So Dakinis could be a female bodhisattva, like the female Buddha Tara, who was a princess long ago in ancient India, who vowed to only be reborn as a woman to show that enlightenment is possible in a woman's form. And she said, as long as there are those who suffer, I too shall remain to remove the darkness of the world. Another story is that so, you know, all of these stories are a metaphor, but Tibetans and ancient Indians are very flowery. I can't apologize for it, but it's a metaphor. And there's a story that the Bodhisattva of compassion, Avalokiteshvara, was looking at the world and just saying, wow, it's such a mess. a bit like activists these days. How are we going to save the world? It's a mess. And he was like, and he cried 2 tears, because no matter how many beings he had already liberated, you know, a billion more appeared, who were messed up and mired and heavily invested in delusion. So out of his eyes sprung 2 emanations of enlightenment. One was Tara, who is the female Buddha of active compassion. And she's actually probably the most prayed to Buddha in Tibet. You know, they praise her every morning, because she's the one who gets things done. She removes obstacles. And the other one was Shambhala, the deity of wealth. So this deity of wealth is not about greed. It's about, you know, creating the energy, the abundance needed to achieve things. You know, and I think the thing about Buddhism and why the stories of these famous women have been lost is that history is written by men. But also, I think these women were not so heavily invested in being known. I think they were probably, some of them were probably quite happy practicing alone with their family or in a mountain cave. You know, they weren't seeking recognition, because to have recognition meant to have to fight the patriarchy. And the more known you become, the more resistance there is to making progress, you know. So they were just like quiet achievers. Many of them were the relatives of some more famous male practitioner. So, you know, one of the most well-known is Yeshe Sogyal, the Queen of Tibet, who was married at a young age to the King of Tibet, even though she didn't want to get married. The story goes that Buddhism was already a little bit known in Tibet and she wanted to become a nun, but her family was just incredibly ambitious and just thought they could use her in a pawn, as a pawn in a chess game to win fame and renown. So she was used as a chess piece to marry the king and get more power for her family. But it turns out her husband, the King of Tibet, was a pretty woke guy, and he invited Padmasambhava to the Indian master who brought Buddhism from India to Tibet. He wasn't a monk, he was a householder lama, and he also brought Vimalamitra, the monk teacher. So from the very beginning, the monastic tradition and the householder lama tradition were established side by side. They established Samye Monastery. They established the fourfold community: monks, nuns, women, lay women, and laymen. But Yeshe Sogyal was given as a gift, because remember, it's medieval Tibet, right? It's feudal. Women didn't have their own autonomy. She was given as a gift to Padmasambhava, but Padmasambhava was even more woke than her husband. And he said that if women have devotion and virtue, their capacity for embodied awakening is greater than men's, because they're already in touch with the intuitive feelings and emotions that I guess the inner world that can give rise to awakening, and the subtle energies. You know, women are very sensitive to the energies and what's going on inside, whereas although I think young men from a young age are naturally sensitive, it's kind of beaten out of them in a way by the way they're raised. You know, it's seen as a bad thing for a young man to be sensitive. Certainly, you know, the way they're raised in America and Australia. I'm not so sure about Europe. Anyway, so Padmasambhava taught Yeshe Sogyal all the teachings, and she became one of his head translators and an accomplished teacher in her own right. There was a time where she went off and did harsh kind of renunciate meditations in the Himalayas, and developed like inner heat practice, Tummo, and spent a few years in meditative retreat. And at that time, like just as for the historical Buddha, the Mara's daughters were appearing before him, trying to tempt him. So on the eve of Yeshe Sogyal's enlightenment, these really handsome guys turned up and said, "Let's party." And she was offered a lot of wealth. It was interesting the way it appeared before her was a little different to the way it appeared for the Buddha. It was like really handsome young men offering her lots of gold, lots of yaks and butter, anything a healthy young Tibetan woman would want. Hey, I built this great house. There's this great jewelry. I'm really handsome. You can come with me. So, all these things were offered to her, and she turned them down and became enlightened. And she became one of the main lineage holders of the Nyingma tradition of Tibetan Buddhism. There were still people who tried to disparage her because she was a woman. But she is in the Nyingma lineages, and she's often shown sitting at the side of Guru Rinpoche, as is his Indian wife, Mandarava, Princess Mandarava. But these women in their own right were great, accomplished female practitioners. Another thing that happened, sadly, to Yeshe Sogyal when she was in the remote mountains was she was raped by some shepherds. And the way that is talked about is there's a little bit of kind of spiritual bypassing going on in terms of the horror of that abuse. But eventually the men that raped her became her students and felt great remorse. So that is how it is covered in her biography. But her own feelings about the issue are not made known, although it says she's already pretty advanced in her practice by then. So then there is the story of Machi Glapdron, who is one of the founders of a practice called chud, which means to cut through, where you imagine it's like about realizing emptiness or selflessness, and you imagine feeding your body to demons as a way to kind of shock yourself into realizing that your body is not you, a bit like the meditations on putridness that some Theravadins do, where they look at all the aspects of the body and they go, wow, this is pretty shocking, and this is not me and not mine. So a bit like Chod is a little bit like that, but it's also like practicing transcendent generosity, where it's like, hey, it's not only not me, but it's all about you. And Machi Glapdron was born around the 11th century, and she was recognized as a highly realized person from a young age. And the lamas who saw her said, oh, you should make her a nun and keep her away from mundane people. And, she should study the Dhamma and engage in practice and live a very pure life. And she's already the reincarnation of a wise person. So she grew up in a kind of protected, wealthy family, kept away from the rest of the world. And she studied Buddhism from a young age as a nun. But as time went by, one night she was like already, maybe an adolescent, and wondering about the world and probably feeling all those hormones and questions that young adolescent people have. And there was a very handsome Indian yogi who was in the house of someone reciting suttas, which is very common in Tibet. Like the Tibetans will sponsor a monk or a nun or a yogi to read the teachings as an act of merit. And they'll have someone, maybe doing pujas 24 hours a day in the shrine room of their house, if they're a very wealthy family, to kind of mitigate their bad karma, I guess, in some way. Anyway, so she fell in love with this ragtag Indian yogi, and they ran away together, and it was seen as a great scandal because she was supposed to be a nun. But by that time, she had already displayed signs. Like one day, her teacher gave an initiation, and it had such a profound effect on Machi that she just didn't act normal for a few days. She kind of wandered around with half her clothes missing, and people thought she'd gone insane. But the teacher said, she's actually the only one who really got it, that this world is not as it appears, and this self is not as it appears. It's a bit like, you know, when you do a long retreat and you come back to the world and you just see people like little mice running in the wheel, and you kind of think, wow, samsara is weird. Anyway, so she ran away with this Indian yogi, and they had 5 kids, and they did a lot of practice in different places. In those days, you know, Dharma practitioners, whether they're householder yogis or monastics, were held in high esteem, and anybody who gave teachings and who read the suttas was given food and donations, so you could kind of travel around and survive. Like, you might have a bit of a hard life, but you could survive. You were valued by society. And so they lived, you know, they went on pilgrimage, they lived in caves, they visited holy places, they attended teachings. And Machi went very deep into this practice of chöd, and she gave the lineage to her children, especially to the women in the females in her family. And there were even people who heard about it from as far away as India, who traveled to Tibet to debate the philosophy of it with her, and she defeated all of them in debate. So after, you know, many years as a yogini and a mother of 5, she said to her husband, okay, it's your turn to mind the kids. I'm going off to get final enlightenment. I love you. And he did. And, you know, the family held the lineage. He held the lineage. The children also participated and took over the lineage. And she achieved final enlightenment and became one of the most highly esteemed lineage holders of the Kagyu tradition. The Kagyu tradition is well respected in Tibetan Buddhism because they have this fusion of this kind of really hardcore yogi meditator. I guess they're the Burmese strain of Tibetan Buddhism, you could say. They're really into hardcore meditation and direct experience, but they've also combined that with the monastic training and the philosophy. So that's Machi Glapdron. And then another famous, and all of these women are said to be Dakinis, are said to be emanations of enlightened women or enlightened beings. And the thing about Dakinis is they don't behave themselves. They're not good girls. They can appear as, you know, outcasts, as old women. They can appear in a way you least expect, to shake you out of your delusion and your stupor. Like, often they'll appear. There was this monk who was really proud of himself as a high caste scholar, and, you know, but he'd practiced for years and he wasn't getting anywhere. And his guru said, you know, you just need to go and talk to this old lady who is, she sells fried fish. And he's like, what could I possibly learn from that woman? And it turned out that she was a great tantric adept, you know, so she ended up revealing this whole cycle of teachings to him. And after that, he completely let go of, what can I say, conventional behavior. But these kind of, this path of sudden intuitive awakening breaks down tired and regimented into, you know, like spirituality from the head up. You know, it tears down the ivory towers and And, you know, there's so many lessons in our lives that do that. Life is full of little earthquakes, isn't it? Like when you get a cancer diagnosis, or when your partner of 20 years says, honey, I want a divorce, you know, or when you have an unplanned pregnancy, or you lose your job. There's just so many little earthquakes in our life that are either a catastrophe or a big chance to grow. And how we approach them is up to us. But that, in essence, is those moments are life-changing, and those things are sometimes the shake-up we needed to change our life and make it better and live more fully. You know, am I living well? Am I loving well? Am I learning to let go? It's not the secure. I mean, we all need a bit of security and a bit of stability, but too much can make us fall asleep, make us not grow. You know, and we kind of numb ourselves with a lot of things, sensual indulgences, and just a certain sense of comfort, you know, that we're sometimes when we get too enmeshed in that, we're not growing. So Dakinis are symbolic of that kind of lightning, non-conceptual cutting through, that earthquake that breaks apart your old identity and your limitations and shows you the mirror of reality. This is who you really are in all your beauty and your horror. This is how you're deceiving yourself. So that is why the stories of tantric adepts are sometimes a little bit fanciful and colorful, but the metaphor is wake up, stop being comfortable, allow the rug to be pulled from under your feet so you can grow. You know, empathize, get out of your cocoon of selfhood. So so these Dakinis could appear in many forms, you know, as human women, or as female masters, or as nuns, or as fruit sellers, or as sex workers. In so many ways they could appear that you just never know. But the universal quality is this quality of cutting through the BS, of taking the sword, taking the sword to your delusion. Yeah. You know, like you'll see Vajrayogini, this red deity, and she has half a skull in her hand, and she's drinking some kind of nectar, right? And she's like half naked, and some Theravadins would be like, what is that? Like, what is, oh my God, that's not the Buddhism I know. But it's a metaphor, right? The fact that she's naked means primordial wisdom is without contrivance. It's naked, aware wisdom, awakening. So this is why Vajrayana teachings are symbolic and need to be explained. And the skull represents the realization of selflessness and self-mastery. And the blood she's drinking represents the nectar of awakening. But I think in Theravada too, you know, in the Therigatha, there is so many deeply humanizing and beautiful stories of awakened women. You know, there's women who had a really dramatic awakening, like Kisa Gotami, whose son died. Like she married and she wasn't that good looking, and the family didn't treat her very well. And when she gave birth to a son, they celebrated her identity and they treated her with kindness for the first time in her life. So she was very attached to being the mother of a son. And when, you know, and she really had trouble conceiving that son. So when the son was taken away by an illness, she was devastated, and she carried his dead body from door to door and cried out in the town, you know, my son is sick, do you have any medicine? And somebody took pity on her and said, maybe the Buddha has some medicine for you. And the Buddha said, yes, Kisa, you just need to find some sesame oil from the house of someone who didn't have someone die in their house. If you take that sesame oil, bring it to me, and we can do something about healing your situation. So she was very enthused, and she carried around the corpse of her son banging on doors saying, do you have sesame oil? And everybody was happy to give her sesame oil. But in every house, she discovered somebody had died. And it slowly dawned on her, death comes to everyone. Death is something we can't avoid. I am not alone in losing my beloved child. And she started to understand the impermanence of life. And when she had a deep insight into the impermanence of life, she saw the futility of simply living for sensual pleasure, or being caught up in prestige or wealth. And then she came back and she laid her son at the Buddha's feet, and she said, I now understand the medicine you were talking about, that death comes to everyone, and that I'm not alone in losing my son, and that we need to practice to attain awakening, to get out of the wheel of suffering. And she asked to become a nun, and she practiced diligently and became a female arhat. And there are so many stories. There are stories of women who were great debaters. There's stories of just elderly women whose maybe their family didn't really want them around anymore and kind of passed them off to the monastery. And just as the candle was burning low, they attained awakening. And there are stories of women who'd escaped domestic violence and said, free, free, free at last, free from kitchen drudgery and my husband's harsh words, and was so happy to be in this life where she got to define her own identity. There were young women who got in. There were women who were so obsessed with their own beauty, they'd be Instagram stars these days. And they went to a teaching of the Buddha, and the Buddha created this illusion of a really glorious, beautiful woman, and then aged her in front, and then turned her into a skeleton and dust. And through this, the woman kind of saw her own impermanence and the futility of pursuing just outward beauty, when spiritual beauty is so much more profound, inner peace is so much more profound. And she got enlightened right there in her couture, her ancient Indian couture. And she also became a nun eventually and got enlightened. But rich and poor, powerful, not powerful, this awakening has come to many people in many ways. Jomo Menmo was a girl born to people of fairly simple means in the 13th century. Her father was a tantric lama, a small-time lama. Her mother died when she was young, and she was sent to mind the sheep in the high mountains. One day when she was about 12 or 13, she fell asleep while she was minding the sheep, and she had a dream where she entered a cave and she saw Vajrayogini. And Vajrayogini gave her a secret teaching. So this is called the Terma teachings, where an awakened, person uncovers a cycle of teachings that have been previously hidden until the time was right for those teachings to emerge. So whether you believe this kind of thing or not, it's up to you. But anyway, she was given this teaching called A Gathering of All Dakini's Secrets. And she wrote this down later on from her dream. And this is a girl who wasn't well educated, she could probably barely read and write. But then later on, as a teenager, she practiced with Guru Choang, who told her to wander the holy places of central Tibet and practice as a yogini with 2 female disciples. And finally, at the age of 36, she said she was weary of samsara and attained rainbow body along with her friends. They just gone. And the story is that they went to a Pure Land. Whether or not that's true, I don't know. But she's held in pretty high esteem, and the teachings she taught as a very unlearned person, like through spontaneous realization, are still recited in Tibet to this day. A bit like you know, the songs of the Yogi Milarepa, sometimes just now and then, to break the monotony of an endless cycle of noble lamas who are highly educated. They like to bring up a peasant who was good with the poetry, and they include them in the lineage. There's also in the Sakya tradition, which is the smallest lineage of Tibetan Buddhism, there is very famous Jetsunmas who are, Jetsunma means Reverend Master, and it could be a male or a female. Jetsun for master, Jetsunma for female master. Like Jetsunma Tenzin Palmo, right? She's highly esteemed. So the Sakya tradition of Tibetan Buddhism is a little different to the other lineages because it's based just on one family, the Kon family, and it's passed, the lineage is passed from master to disciple, uncle to son, uncle to nephew, goes between two families in the Kon family line. And in all of these families, there has always been very accomplished sisters, or, you know, women who are not, like the women who marry into the families pretty much run the tradition. They do all of the administration and running the monasteries, running the household, raising the money, while the men kind of meditate. I mean, it's not necessarily a very egalitarian setup, but the women are actually instrumental in the lineage continuing, as well as, you know, having children to perpetuate the lineage. But anyway, what I find interesting is the nuns in this family were highly, the sisters, you know, if you had a daughter, she would become a nun and she would become part of the Kon family tradition of nuns who held the Vajrayogini lineage. And they were pretty highly esteemed. In every generation, there was one. And Sakyatreesen's sister, who now lives in Canada, and she's in her 70s now, she was a nun until Tibet was invaded. And then, you know, there was great upheaval and she ended up falling in love and getting married. But she speaks of great fondness with her, of her years being a nun. She said she felt most free at that time when she had a lot of time to practice full time. But she said being a mother made her get real about her Dharma practice. And, you know, there's a story of like the monks feeling proud because these monks have done a philosophical degree and studied for many, many years. And they're like, what could a woman possibly teach me? And the story is that the previous generation of these Sakya Jetsunmas, she had a red mala, which is very common in the Vajrayogini practice. And she just let it, the mala just stayed suspended in space. And apparently that Jetsunma ended up just going direct to Vajrayogini's Pure Land. You know, I mean, I guess with Theravadins, all of these talk of miracles and attaining rainbow body, and it's all seems a little bit far-fetched. But I think what the common thread through all of these stories of awakening and the kind of stories of awakening you find in the Therigatha is women being the authors of their own story, women breaking the traditional norms of what is expected of a woman, the role she's supposed to play. Women showing that despite the obstacles, the kind of systemic agenda to silence them, they can thrive even despite that. They shouldn't have to thrive despite that. They should be able to, you know, everybody, whatever they identify as, male, female, non-binary, should thrive and not have to thrive despite the system. But women have always been there, and any kind of marginalized person has always been there. So now is the time for those stories of awakening for everybody, you know, whether they're able-bodied, disabled, queer, straight, binary, non-binary. Those stories need to come forward from the people that haven't been heard from. But it is very clear from these stories, and there's so many stories that still haven't been translated, that awakening is possible in all kinds of circumstances. there are 5 Dakini families that have different activities. There is the Padma family, which is symbolized by the color red, and that is transforming desire into the wisdom of discrimination, knowing what to adopt and what to reject, renunciation, I guess you could say. The Ratna family, which transforms greed and miserliness into abundance. The Akshobhya family, that transforms hatred into the mirror-like wisdom, because when someone triggers you, they show you something unresolved in yourself, isn't it? Hatred or aversion can be a powerful mirror about what we haven't resolved in ourselves. The wisdom, I suppose in some way it's like the wisdom of emptiness. And the Vairochana family is transforming ignorance into the wisdom of the Dhammadhatu, the wisdom of all-pervading suchness, all-pervading truth, that everything is has an innately pure potential. And the final one is, it's a green Buddha. I've forgotten his name. It's very terrible for a nun to forget. But he's transformed, Amoghasiddhi, he's transforming jealousy into the wisdom of accomplishment. Because there's this thing that we get where if we're jealous of someone else's accomplishments, it's a bit of a loser emotion, you know, like, oh, they've got all that nice stuff and I don't. So rather than being jealous, we're like, okay, we rejoice in their good fortune and we try to learn what we can do to change our situation, to reclaim our agency, so to speak. So Dakinis they could be messengers that will bring a teaching to someone. They could be a meditational deity, or they could be a human woman. But the common factor is that wisdom, primordial wisdom that cuts through in a non-conventional way, that is swift and shocking in some way. And it's not just the case that those Dakinis are there, you know, to help men get awakening. They also help women. They're not just like attractive babes. They are teachers and awakened beings in their own right. And it's often said that one should have, especially a Vajrayana practitioner, should have reverence for Dakinis, because if one doesn't, they can unleash all kinds of chaos on you. So, and you know, it's so interesting that disagreeable women who don't toe the line, are described as crazy. I mean, look at the conservatorship on Britney Spears right now, that because she wouldn't toe the line of being, you know, she was like basically a little girl who was sexualized, and everything about her appearance and the powerful way she used to sing before she was turned into a sexualized teenager. Her whole image was controlled by men, you know, and as soon as she refused to play that game, she was declared as crazy. And, you know, she's a 40-year-old woman who can't even get her own birth control removed, you know, to have a baby, or to say she doesn't want to do a show. And that's what happens to women who are disagreeable. You know, there are some female scientists whose work was stolen by men, and they were declared insane and put in asylums. I mean, a lot of Camille Claudel, the female artist's work, was stolen, and she was also put in an asylum. But, you know, disagreeable women are burned alive or beaten or stoned to death simply for telling the truth, simply for not conforming, simply for being too powerful to control. And yet there has always been this fear of the power that women represent, the gateway of life and death, whether or not they choose to have children or not. It's not just a biological thing, it's a spiritual, elemental quality of the sacred feminine. And the sacred feminine, as I said, is present in men as well. And the sacred masculine is also present in women. And I think we need to reclaim the sacred masculine, to not just say what's wrong with men, but the beauty men have, what is a positive masculinity men can move towards. And obviously, this is just an archetype. Gender is a spectrum, so there will be a whole bunch of people who are just beyond gender. Ultimately, enlightenment is beyond gender anyway. But if one element is silenced or suppressed for a very long time, it's important to reclaim that lost part of our humanity and empower it again. Which is why, when we say pride, it's not egotism, it's reclaiming what has been denigrated and suppressed. Which is why, women are reclaiming pride in being women. People of color are reclaiming pride in their indigenous culture and the color of their skin, or disabled people are reclaiming their own autonomy and the power and abilities they have as disabled people, and reclaiming their own voices. And it's not because they're better than anyone else, it's because they haven't been allowed to have personhood. So that pride is a very healthy and necessary thing to reestablish balance in society and humanity. And it's not an attack on heterosexual cisgender people. It's simply a coming back into balance so that everybody's voices are heard. When we're all heard, there can be justice, there can be compassion. But when only a small portion of the population has the script, everybody else feels oppressed. Nobody else's voices are heard, which is not good in Buddhism or in society. So that's my spiel on Dakinis and Demonesses. I hope you find something of value in that. I think every monastery should have a representative of the sacred feminine there, as well as the sacred masculine. And nobody should feel, whether you're a mother, whether you're a poor person, whether you're a disabled person or a queer person or whatever kind of person, nobody should feel that they can't become a Buddha. Sometimes it's the more you've been through in your life, the more compost you have to grow the roses of insight. So don't see that as an obstacle. See that as a chance to grow. And the presence of queer people or monks and nuns doesn't mean that there's less for you, or that you can't get enlightened as a lay person or as a straight person or whatever. It's not a threat to you. It's simply diversity and everybody's voice being heard makes us all stronger.